Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. All right. How's everyone doing today? Let's begin. We going to open my thing. All right. So this is one of, I think, the fundamentals of Judaism. I know that I say that every week, but the truth is that the laws that we're going through at this stage in the game, a lot of them are fundamentals. So I'm not saying it just because, but they're actually classified as fundamentals. In our order and the process that we're going through for our studies these days, we are going through the order of the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah. And one thing is fascinating about Judaism. You know, I think it was Sigmund Freud, that he wrote that one of the great inventions of the Jewish nation was the ability to connect to the abstract. And people creating this religion based on a God that you cannot see, that you cannot feel, that you cannot know, and you simply have to believe in it. He says this is one of the great accomplishments of Judaism. And in his words, one of the reasons why he believed that it was such a great accomplishment was because if you have something that you cannot feel, that you cannot see, that you cannot probably describe, then you will never ever complete your goal and your mission. And you could always reach higher levels. Now, I don't know if Sigmund Freud meant this as a full compliment to Judaism, and I think in certain ways he was kind of making fun of the fact that Judaism is what it is. But the truth is that he is partially correct, but he's also partially wrong. The truth is that there's a tremendous struggle that we as Jewish people have in trying to connect to God. We cannot see God, we cannot feel God, we cannot really know God. So how are we as physical human beings supposed to connect to God? A God that we cannot see, we cannot know, we cannot hear. How are we supposed to make a relationship and obey a God that from our world almost does not exist within our own reality? It only exists if we make God exist. So how are we supposed to make such an existence exist? I can relate to the human being in front of me. I can even relate to the mobile phone or the computer or the pair of scissors that is keeping my desk all untidy. But how do I connect to a God that I cannot see or relate to? So the Torah tells us something very interesting. Let's look over here. If you take a moment to look at my screen, I want to just have a quick look if I can see something.
While you look it up, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You say we can't feel God. Somebody told me recently that your conscience tells you what's right and wrong. That's part of your neshama, part of the piece of God within you.
Yes.
So if you feel that you have to do something, you don't feel like it, and your neshama gives you a guilty feeling, or your neshama gives you a good feeling that you do a mitzvah, is that not feeling God within you?
The answer is correct, but the question I have for you is, how do you know what is your true feeling of God and what is not? When do you know?
If you know you do a mitzvah and you feel good about it, it's an acknowledgement that you did what you're supposed to do. We all know what to do, but we choose not to do that, or we do. it's the consciousness of your conscience to do the right thing deliberately.
Okay,
Right?
Fritz, I agree with you in theory, but not in practice. And I will tell you why I don't agree with you in practice. Because unfortunately, not everybody has as good a conscience as you. In the words of one of the worst people to live in history, Adolf Hitler, Yamach Shemoy, may his name be erased, he said the Jewish people invented the concept of a conscience. Now, that would have been the greatest praise in the way you're saying it, but in the way he said it as a derogatory statement. And I think,
Is his
and I
opinion
think that the
relevant?
truth is, to a certain degree, you're saying the same thing, that we have a conscience which could be very good. But unfortunately, when you rely on your pure instinct and feeling, people sometimes make terrible mistakes. And there's a famous statement in the Talmud, Adam Korav Eitzel Atzmai, man is close to themselves, which means that we as human beings are instinctively and naturally subjective and biased beings. And if we do not have objective outside information that is telling us wrong from right and going based on our inner heart and conscience, we will be very, very misled and go in very wrong paths. So, Fritz, in answer to your question, I'll say that in essence you are correct, but in practice you are totally incorrect. It's a very dangerous path.
Okay.
Do you understand? I'm sorry for being so blunt, but do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand.
Okay.
Always be blunt, because that's clear language.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm trying to say. It's a very just to labor your point a little bit. The concept of people, the famous line that we as rabbis hear most often is, Rabbi, I'm Jewish in my heart. You know what that basically means? It basically means, Rabbi, leave me alone. I don't want to do anything Jewish and I'll figure out my own life. That's exactly what one thing that we're concerned about. But more importantly is when you have people that want to reinvent Judaism to fit their own agenda. You understand what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And then they will convince themselves that they are doing the correct thing. Now, sometimes they will be, and probably majority of the case they will be, but sometimes new movements arise, and we're seeing that happening in our days, where people who have quote unquote decided that this is the humanistic, this is the good, this is the godly way. And if they were to look at the Torah itself, they would see that they are not only incorrect, but they are 180 degrees in the wrong direction. It's not like 10 degrees in the wrong direction. They're sometimes 180 degrees in the wrong direction. And that comes from the very notion. So that's why I'm saying that you are, in essence, you are correct. Because in essence, I believe that if people were to dig deep down, they would see that deep down in their deepest conscious, they want the right, the truth. And their soul is one with God's soul. And that's why I say you are 100% correct. But in practice, most people are not that connected to their souls. Most people live on a very superficial level. And therefore, going in the direction of our going and deep and going by my own conscience, you are going to be led on the wrong path some of the times. And sometimes not just the wrong path, but 180 degrees in the wrong direction. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. So it's a very important point that you brought that up, so I appreciate that. And that, even more importantly, emphasizes the importance of tonight's discussion. So let's look at the source of this law. It's actually one of the 613 mitzvot according to the Maimonides and Sefer HaChinuch, the people that think. And this is the mitzvah that we're going to be learning tonight. I think it's mitzvah number 6 or 7. I didn't check what number it is. But let's have a look at it. It's verse 20. It says as follows: Et Hashem Elokecha tira, you should fear Hashem, your God. Or totavod, you should serve him. Or votibak, and you should cleave to him. Or vishmot tishaveya, and you shall swear by his name. Now, there's a lot. It's a heavy verse. I'm not going to get into everything that it says in this verse. It's very heavy. But I'm going to emphasize what I just started off tonight's discussion with, these words, "Ovotid bak," and you shall cleave to him. My question to you is, how do you cleave to God? After what we discussed earlier, that cleaving to God seems to be almost impossible when you cannot see God, you cannot fathom God in his true essence. So how do you cleave to God? How do you have a relationship? It's telling you to have a relationship with God. The Torah is commanding you that you should fear him. Okay, I could fear. That's somewhat understood. And we've spoken about the mitzvah of fear. That was actually one of the first mitzvot that we spoke about, love and fear of God, right? Serving God. That's a whole very general, all the mitzvot. But what is these words to cleave to God? In other words, he's saying, don't just love or fear. I want you to actually have a relationship to God. What are you cleaving to? So let's look at how some of the commentaries, and mainly in particularly the people that authored this mitzvah, how they described it. So let's look over here. Sefer HaChinuch puts it way later as mitzvah 434. Okay, so he says, to cling. What does it mean? He says there's a mitzvah actually which is lidobek bechachmei Torah. To, whoops, what happened? What did I touch? What did I do that I shouldn't have done? Everything. Okay, there you go. Now let's get it back centered. Ooh, hello. Oh, that's what happened. That happened. Okay, when you play with technology, it's not your field. Funny things happen. Okay. Again, now I know if you click there, it jumps a lot. Okay, so this I'll be kind to you, and I'll go through it in Hebrew, and I'll let Reuven, sorry, in English, and I'll let Reuven worry about breaking his eyes on the Hebrew. That we were commanded to associate and to cling to Torah sages. What? So that I'm just going to leave it at this stage at this point. So that we learn its glorious commandments from them, and they teach us its true opinions, which is received through them about it. And about this, it is stated in Deuteronomy 10, chapter 10, verse 20, to him shall you cling. So he's actually made a whole mitzvah out of this. It says in the verse, you shall cling to him. Who's him? God. And the command is repeated in another place. It says in the next chapter, and to cling to him, of Osid Bak. And they, may their memory be blessed, said, and it is possible for a person to cleave to, and is it possible for a person to cleave to the divine presence? Can we cleave to God? What does it say? And behold, it is written, for the Lord your God is a consuming fire. Try to attach yourself to a fire. You can't, right? That's actually the Torah says it. Rather, one who clings to the Torah scholars and their students is as if he has clinged, as if he clings to him, blessed be he, as if he cleaves to God. And from this, our rabbis, may their memory be blessed, learn that anyone who marries, okay, we're going to get into some practical, I'll discuss this, marries the daughter of a scholar, etc. Okay, we'll get back into that in a moment. Okay, so let me give myself, hey Hazel, welcome. Hey Joe.
Oh, thank you.
All right, so what have we seen so far? I've just showed you a mitzvah, and it says that you should cleave to God. The rabbis had no clue what it was talking about, so they made up a beautiful way of understanding it. You know what? God wants you to connect and respect us. Isn't that a great way? The Torah scholars wanted to know how to translate, and they said, well, this is the space that you're supposed to respect us. Fascinating, isn't it? Well, no, that's not exactly how it works. The way it works is as follows. They see this verse that says that you have to cleave to God. They know that on a literal sense, that's not something that the average person can do. So they say, hold on a second. It's telling us to cleave to the teachings of God, the Torah. So how do you do that? Cleave to the people whose Torah, that Torah is their life. In other words, if you're going to have a choice, how are you going to connect to God? Connect to God through cleaving to those that cleave to God more than anybody else. That's the only way that you can do it.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I'll try not to be a troublemaker, but that language of the cleaving, another place that we see that language used is in description of a marriage, of husband and wife. So I wonder if there is some connection between that quality of attachment and what we're talking about here.
Fascinating. It says that you're 100% right. I didn't even think about that. Thank you for pointing that out. I didn't even think about it. I did point out that the word tidbak means to make a relationship. But just to remind, so the words in Genesis and Bereshit, after Eve is created, it says, Al Kain Yazov ish et aviv et imo, v'davak beishto, v'ayu lebasar echad, exactly the same terminology. Ruben. So what is it saying? It says, therefore man shall leave his mother and father, v'davak, and you should cleave, the same word, cleave to your wife, v'ayu lebasar echad, when you cleave.
Davak only begot, that's all. No beishto v'lo batir. Only begot.
So that, Ruben. Okay.
You forgot to say your own wife. Yeah.
Yes. So your own wife. Yes. Thank you. So yeah, beautiful point out. Well, what does that teach you? That's exactly the point. And thank you. You actually allowed me to bring down my point much better because of that wording. That shows you that the word v'davak doesn't mean anything else other than have a relationship. Just like by man and wife, it says when you have a relationship. But davak over there, it says be intimate with your spouse, with your wife, and then by you'll come into one person, you'll become to one flesh, which means that through the intimacy you'll have a child, and that child will be a makeup of both you and the other. And we can go on to all different types of ways of looking and interpreting based on that. That therefore, if God is saying that He wants us to cleave to Him, by the way, in Kabbalah and throughout Torah, we do refer to man being is a relationship with God, that we are the feminine element of the relationship. And God, by the way, if you ever wonder why we always refer to as him, why is it Ovoi Sidbak? And he's sorry for throwing in something politically incorrect and not polite. It's not telling us to have a homosexual relationship. It's telling us to have a heterosexual relationship. God is referred to as the him in this context, right? And we are the feminine. So it's 100% on target. Joe, thank you. I really appreciate that point because you made my night so far with that point. Beautiful. So a voice sit back is telling us that we should cleave to God and become attached to Him. And our struggle is that I can understand if you tell me if you want me to connect to my wife, to my spouse, because it's another human being just like me. But if you tell me that you want me to cleave to God, I'm going to struggle. I can't be intimate with God. So how do we understand it? So it tells us God, when He gave us the oral Torah. Now this is, by the way I understand it. God gives us the oral Torah. He gave us interpretation. By the way, what I said before, the rabbis came and they didn't understand it, and therefore they came with interpretation. Incorrect. That's not the meaning. The way it worked was, this line would have been given over to Moses, and Moses would have received the interpretation, the meaning, just like all of Shema. Anything, you can't take anything 100% literal the way it is in the Torah. There's the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral interpretation. What is the oral interpretation? And Moses gave over to the students afterwards that this line means that God wants us to cleave to the people that are the giants in the Torah, the ones that study God's Torah, God's will, the ones that study, in other words, God. By cleaving to them, you will thereby be cleaving to God. You want to have a relationship with God, you need to first have a relationship with the Torah scholars. Who makes up that interpretation? It's a tradition from Moses going back to God, not made up by anybody else. It wasn't derived. It is a clear understanding. Why? Because it becomes a mitzvah. Otherwise, it could not become a mitzvah. It could not become a mitzvah if it was an interpretation based on the rabbis. So that's how we can be certain of that. Okay, now, so we've established that we have now a new commandment. Sorry, not a new commandment. We have an understanding of the existing commandment. What is the existing commandment? The existing commandment is that we should have a relationship or have a connection with the righteous, pious sages and scholars of our time, not the academic secular scholars necessarily, or that may benefit you in some way. But we're talking about particularly there's a mitzvah to cleave to Torah scholars and sense. Okay? So let's look at what is this concept, when does it apply, and what does it mean? Okay, that was just the very short intro that took us 25 minutes. Go ahead, Fritz.
I spoke recently with people who are very involved in the liberal shul. They said rabbis made an explanation and it is their opinion. I mentioned to them their opinion is in the framework of the Torah. Yeah, but it is still the opinion of men. I listened to what you just said, but I found it hard to make it palatable to them. To say these people are experts at the highest level. You need to give them the credit that they know better than the current people we have as scholars.
Fritz, you're 100% correct. This past Thursday, when we did our Ethics of Our Fathers discussion, the Pirkei Avot discussion, I introduced Rabbi Huda Nasi, who was the man that compiled the Mishnah, which was the first compilation of the Oral Torah. And over there, I gave a short interpretation of this concept. You weren't there on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
No.
Are you still in Sydney, by the way?
I was at the time, yes.
Right, are you okay? So I did actually give a short interpretation to this exactly concept, exactly a short idea of how the Oral Torah works, even though that was not the topic of our discussion. Now, I would like to give a full-on series on how the Oral Torah works to help you clarify this. Till I studied this myself, and even after being years in yeshiva, I did not have this clear. So what I'm saying to you is I don't think you should be feeling bad that you struggle to explain this concept, because it's something that the average yeshiva student can't explain. When I say yeshiva student, even that means a rabbi that's been through the concept. You suddenly have to have an understanding of the whole history and the whole development of the Oral Torah in order to properly make justice, to justly explain this concept.
Okay, thank you.
So in answers, I hope that we will do it. It is very important to do. But the short explanation I want you to understand is that there's two types of ideas in the Torah. There's one which were God-given interpretations to the Torah and saying that this is the meaning of the Torah. That's known as the basic fundamentals of the Oral Torah. That was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And that was just the basic of what does each word mean. That's an oral tradition going down from generation to generation. And then there's a second concept, which is when we have questions that arise that are not clearly iterated, whether it's in the written Torah or in the oral interpretation, and we now have new questions. How do we find out the answers on those new questions? Then we have something called derivation, which is a process that God gave to Moses, ideas of how we can get out answers when we find ourselves in a dilemma, in questions in the Torah that are not answered through a very basic understanding of the simple law. Okay? And that's why we have thousands upon thousands of halachot throughout history. So when you have that understanding, that's where there's space for interpretation in one area. In another area there's absolutely no space for interpretation. So I would say, getting back to our discussion, in the discussion that this word of votid bak, the mitzvah to cleave to God, and the meaning of that is that you should cleave to the Torah scholars and giants of each generation and of previous generations, this is not an interpretation. This is the meaning given by God to Moses. Okay? This is not interpretation. So it's important to understand that difference. So thanks for that. Okay, so let's understand this commandment. So when does it apply? Most of these first mitzvot, we're still in the early mitzvot. We see there's a 613 to go through. I think we've been through about 5 of them or 10 of them or so. And most of these are what we call mitzvahs tmidios. Mitzvahs tmidios means that they apply at all times in all places. It's a constant mitzvah for all times and all places, and all Jews, no matter who they are. Okay, so let's understand what this means. It basically is telling us something which I think many of us would understand as being logical, but not necessarily considered a mitzvah. The mitzvah is that God wants us to connect. He has ways of how we connect. So he gives us the Torah. We have an obligation to study the Torah. But it's not enough for us just to study Torah ourselves. You have some people today that have become Torah scholars themselves in their own right, but simply by studying and reading texts, never having learned from a teacher. Now, here's the thing. There's two types of rabbis. There's rabbis that are books, and there's rabbis that are people. They're one and the same thing. There's two elements in my understanding of this. The one thing is to tell us that in the old days, before the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, there was one book of the Torah. There was one book of the Torah. What was that book of the Torah? The 5 books of Moses before the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. Since then, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi compiled the oral Torah some 1,930 something years ago. When he compiled the Mishnah, ever since then, we have had books upon books upon books upon books of describing the Torah to us. Now, what I'm saying is, the classic argument of the average Christian is we don't believe in your oral Torah. When you ask a Christian, why do you not believe in all of the Torah? What about Shabbat? What about Kashrut? Well, those are interpretations, etc., etc. There's a New Testament, etc. All those type of things. So what's the answer that they're going to get away with? How will they try to get away with the fact that they don't keep all of the Torah? They'll say, well, it's just the oral Torah. It's not the real thing, so to speak. And therefore, they would say that all you need is the 5 books of Moses. You need to have the Tanakh and the 5 books of Moses and the prophets and the writings, and that's what we believe in. Okay, great. Now that's a good starting point if you don't want to start adding any New Testaments to it. But the problem is that if you only have your Judaism based on, you are missing the most fundamental part of it, which is the oral Torah. So before the oral Torah was compiled, how did you learn the oral Torah? In other words, how did you understand what the Torah has no meaning in and of itself. How did you study it? Because you went to a teacher, a rabbi, who had got it back from his rabbi. Rabbi is just the word that we use, but who got it back from their teacher, going all the way back to Moses. And that's why you had something called smicha. Till the time of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, there was something called smicha. What was smicha? Smicha was that there was a rabbi who had himself had a tradition of the way, all the way back to Moses, of having a full and comprehensive understanding and knowledge of the entire oral Torah. And that's what you did. So the only way that you can truly study the Torah is if you went to a teacher. Now, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi realized that that wasn't going to stay, so he wrote down part of it, and he went against the law in order to save Judaism, a discussion for another time. In order to save Jewry, he wrote down the oral Torah, a discussion that we discussed on Thursday. Okay, so that's the one element. So today, you don't need necessarily to understand the Torah, you don't necessarily need to find your own mentor. Okay? You could still have an understanding of the Torah by taking the books that were written by the Torah scholars of previous generations. And you would be fulfilling this mitzvah. And this mitzvah is such a fundamental mitzvah. Why? Because without this mitzvah, we have no understanding of the Torah. This is the way that we connect to God. This is the way we understand the Torah, by studying the oral Torah. So there's the one element of it, which is studying the interpretations of the Torah. There is a second element to it, which is simply cleaving to Torah scholars, as in the actual people, having a relationship with them, which is where it gets controversial. Are you supposed to serve a human being? And of course, we know that as Jewish people, we're not allowed to serve a human being. We're not allowed to serve anybody other than God. So what it tells us is that we have to study from them, respect them, treat them with a lot of respect, and learn from them, but not worship them. Can you have a picture of a rabbi on your wall? You know, when the Hasidic movement, particularly in the last generation, started, there was the Hasidim came so close to their rebbes and their mentors, they took it to this law, which is actually this law, to the next level, that they started even putting pictures of their rebbe on the wall. That happened most predominantly in the last generations when pictures came of easier to get hold of, and everyone was putting pictures of the rebbe all over the place. So at first, all the other groups, particularly the opposing groups to the Hasidic movement, said, how could you put a picture of a rabbi? That's idolatrous, right? And they had but the funny thing is that today everybody does it. Everybody has, whether you're Sephardi, you have pictures of the Baba Sali, or Abadja Yosef, or Mordechai Eliyahu, or whoever the great Sephardi rabbis are. If you're Ashkenazi and you're Litvak, you'll have the Chafetz Chaim and the Vilna Gaon picture, and who knows who else. Anyway, everybody today has pictures on their walls. It's almost like an unheard of thing of people that don't. Sorry?
Does that make it right? If it says that you can't have an image.
Well, obviously what we understand is that the initial understanding of that was an incorrect understanding, and it came from a biased opposition in general to a particular movement. And then once people realize, hey, there's actually absolutely nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with having pictures of tzaddikim, of righteous people. Not only that, if anything, based on what we're studying tonight, it might even be a mitzvah to have a picture of a tzaddik. It's certainly not a mitzvah. As long as you don't worship, you cannot have it in your shul, in the front where you are facing, 100% that would be forbidden. But to have it anywhere else in your house as a role model, as something you're connecting to, I would say not only is it not an avera, and certainly not the concept of idolatry, if anything, it is a mitzvah, as we are seeing in tonight's discussion.
Can you send me a picture of yourself?
You can take a picture of your screen.
Okay.
I am in the screen these days. I'm coming into your house. So here's the actually a funny story. There was once I think it was a child that went to visit the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbetzin. And I don't think the child really understood that this is the Rebbe's wife. So the child said to the Rebbetzin, every house that I've been in Crown Heights, in this neighborhood, I've been to lots of, every house has a picture of the Rebbe. This is the only house that I've seen that has no picture of the Rebbe. And she said, because over here we have the real thing. Anyway, I just thought it was a cute story. It's a famous story. It was the Rebbetzins Yahrzeit on last week, Thursday. Okay, so if you have the real thing, then you can get away with it. So we see this concept come out in another famous area. I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago in Shul, when we had the splitting of the sea. We know that splitting of the sea was kind of the introduction and the major start of the Jewish people was the 10 plagues, the Exodus, the splitting of the sea. Those were the major introductions that the Jewish people had to go through in order to receive the Torah. And after the splitting of the sea and the Egyptians drown, just before the Torah starts singing the song, as Yeshua, the song that the Jewish people sang, the Torah says, Vayaminu ba'Hashem, that the Jewish people believed in God, over Moshe Avdo, and in his Moshe, his servant. And it's almost like equating the two. It puts them on an equal basis, that you got God and you got Moshe, which teaches us what? That in order for them to get God, they actually had to believe in Moshe. Without having Moshe, they wouldn't have had that connection to God. So it teaches us that in order to have a proper connection with God, you need to have that connection with Moshe. So we see that throughout the generations, whenever God wanted to send a message to the people, he spoke through these people. He had the concept of prophecy. We spoke about the concept of prophecy, and this is connected to this law. He teaches them through prophecy, and he also he sends his miracles and his messages through these Torah scholars in general. You know, there's one of my favorite characters of the Bible, of the Torah, is Elisha. Elisha, the prophet Elisha. If you were to look at anybody that has crazy and wacko stories in the Torah, it's Elisha. He's got miraculous story after miraculous story. I think I once went into one of our classes. We went into some of those discussions. He's got the story of the jug that never empties, and he's got the story of bringing the child back to life, and he's got the story of how he saves all the Jewish people by saying that there's going to be tons of food tomorrow. So many different stories. But the one that he studies from is who's his mentor. His mentor is Elijah the prophet. And it says something interesting about him and Elijah the prophet. It doesn't say so much that he studied from Elijah. It says that he served Elijah, Eliyahu, another, which teaches us something interesting. Till now, what I've been speaking about is the concept of studying from the righteous, from the scholars. But it tells us that actually this mitzvah in particular, to cleave to them is not just to learn from them, it's actually to serve them and to do things to be there for them. And not only that, you find a similar concept by Joshua, the successor of Moshe. It does not say that Joshua was the successor of Moses because he studied, even though it does tell us that Nar loy yamush, I think the word is yamush, mitach oil, he never left Moses' side. But it doesn't call him the student of Moses again. What does the Torah call Joshua? It calls him the Mesharis, the servant of Moshe, which teaches us something fundamental. If you truly want to connect to a Torah scholar, it's not enough to study from them. You have to serve them. You have to be in their presence. You have to give to them. And these were the great successes of their predecessors throughout time. I could tell you about the Rebbe in our modern day era. The Rebbe didn't just study from the previous Rebbe, he certainly did. But we know that he also served him and took care of him. And this is considered something fundamental. And not only that, we say that sometimes some people, not everybody has the ability to study from the scholar. Not everybody has the headspace or the intellectual capacity to become the next scholar. But we're told that when you can't, just by serving the students of Talmidei Chacham students, the reward is as though you learned. So much so that throughout the generations till this very day, there are those people that feel that even though they struggle, so what do? They go into the Bet Midrash, they go into the house of study, and they go and serve coffee to everybody, and they clean up after them. And they do this with an absolute joy, because they know that through doing this, they're actually connecting to those Talmidei Chachamim, to those, and it's as though that which they may be struggling with they're achieving through their work. But what we're learning from, it's not enough just to study from the Torah sages. You also have to serve them, yeah, and which teaches us something which is really important. Now, one of the reasons why we speak about the oral Torah not being written down is for this very reason. God didn't want the oral Torah to be written down, and it's called the oral Torah for this reason, even though today it's almost all compiled. Why did God, if God wanted the oral Torah to be made oral, Torah Shebal Peh, Lama Yeshem Tzibuk, why do we have it written down? Of course, that was the great transgression of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, because he did it to save the Jewish people. But why did he want to do it? For this very reason. He wanted people to connect to human beings. He wanted us to study from another human being for numerous reasons. Number one, because when you study from a book, as soon as something has been put down into paper, there are many ways of how it can be interpreted. But when you have a human being in front of you, you have the ability to question, ask them, and to get the clarity and to figure out exactly what they intended. Something which you cannot necessarily do from a written piece of work. Number two, and even more importantly for tonight's discussion, is that you would get to see the way they behave. Today we have people living in the middle of the boondocks. In Kalamazoo, I've got a brother that lives in Kalamazoo. And I just read today that the CEO of Pfizer, who's I think today the biggest suppliers of the vaccine, is based in Kalamazoo, which is I think the call to fame that my brother could have, because there's not much else happening in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So if you're living in the middle of Kalamazoo, where there's absolutely no Jewish infrastructure, one of the incredible things about today's day and age is you could still study from another person. But the truth is that it's not enough. It's better than nothing, 100%. If you want to truly become a truly holy Jew, so to speak, in the essential sense, live onto the highest level, you need to not just study from them, as in with their writing or their lessons, you have to go and live and see how they would behave. There's a fascinating concept that the Lubavitcher Rebbe started with the students, at least from Israel. So, of course, the Chabad movement, there was a lot of students that, I suppose, there was two main centers after the destruction of European Jewry. During European Jewry, one of the things that Hasidim did, unlike other people, was that they would always go and spend time at their Rebbe. And the reason why they did that is because they didn't want to just get the text. And people would come back to the text and hear the stories, but they actually wanted to go and watch and admire and see how this person lives. And they would go and spend usually the month of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, Kippur, and Sukkot, because that's when you have the most colorful time of the year. Or some would go for Pesach. But generally, those were the times that people went. The Rebbe initiated that for the Israeli students, which was like really the second place, the students were mainly coming, at least in the early years, mainly from either America, and therefore they would get to see the Rebbe in action, and they would be brought up on, so to speak, on the Rebbe's doorstep. But for students that weren't, that they should spend a year in 770. They would spend an entire year, because through the year you go through the entire cycle of Jewish festivals and occurrences. So the Rebbe initiated something, and particularly this was the ones that really took up on this was the Israeli Bachram, these Israeli students that do it till today, even though we don't necessarily see the Rebbe, but at least they see how the Rebbe Shul is conducted over a year's space. Of course, it's not the same thing since the Rebbe's passed. But this concept was that you would go and you see how the Rebbe behaves for an entire year. So the students, after they finish their regular stint in yeshiva, they then go to 770, and there would be every davening with the Rebbe and that's the truest essence of this in today's day and age. to study and watch and observe how these people live their lives. So that's a really important thing. We learned this, as I mentioned, from Elisha and from Yoshua, that they weren't just the students, but they were the Masharis. In other words, they were involved in understanding the day-to-day life. So we're told about this, when you have certain things that smell, that when sometimes you have like a particular smell and it reminds you of something. Sometimes you could, I don't know what it is. This is probably not a masculine thing, but let's say there was, you remember the smell of your wedding day, or the flowers on your wedding day, and you're walking past a flower store and you smell that smell, and it's suddenly the smell. What does it cause you to do? It causes you to remind you of something else where you had the same smell. So some of the masters, the Torah masters, that hanging around with the tzaddik, you get the smell of the Garden of Eden. They get the smell of godliness, so to speak, and it reminds you of what it means to be around God, what it means to be around goodness and holiness, and it's there to rub off on you. And that's why God gives it. So to speak, you can't, as we mentioned in the beginning, you can't have this relationship where you're actually in a relationship with God. But when you hang around a person that is on such a level, you start to feel that holiness. You feel that godliness. It rubs off on you. It's like the same thing when we were hanging around good people. God was basically telling us over here, I don't want you to just take the laws and apply them and study them and be academic about them and even be active about them and perform them. I want you to feel them. The way you do that is by seeing somebody else that lives with godliness. So we as human beings struggle to see godliness, to perceive godliness, but these people, the really righteous and real saints, they are able to cleave to it. So there's a famous story of the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek was a third Chabad Rebbe, that a man comes to him and says to him, he lived about 150 years ago. Somebody comes to him and he says, Rebbe, I really struggle to believe in God. And the Rebbe said to him, "Still, tell me something. Do you trust me?" So he says, "Yeah, sure, Rebbe. I see you're a holy person. I know. I can see. I've seen your blessings come true. Whatever." So he says, "So you trust me? Do you believe me?" So he says, "Yeah." He says, "Trust me. I promise you, there's a God." So he says, if you can trust me on anything else, you can trust me on this too. Now, what is he saying? The Tzemach Tzedek was on such a level that he lived with God in his life as a real concept, as a tzaddik is the person, and we speak about this on our, I like to connect everything to everything, every other shir that we give, so that you have to feel like you're missing out. Our Shabbos morning shir, where we're talking about what a tzaddik is these days, he's a person that lives in the godly reality. So when I started our discussion tonight saying that we struggle to connect to God, yes, but the tzaddik struggles to connect to physicality to a certain degree, right? They despise, we mentioned how they despise certain physical desires and pleasures because that's foreign to them. To them, real and truth is godliness. So for us to connect to that level is a struggle. That's why I would not encourage you to put a picture of myself on the wall, because it's better put a picture of your grandfather, because that's probably had a better connection. But certainly have a connection to those people that you love. But if you were to take a picture of the Rebbe, you're putting in the presence of a person that lived in the godly reality. So when you connected to the Rebbe, you weren't connecting to the Rebbe. You were connecting to the Rebbe's connection, the reality that the Rebbe lives in. That's what I meant, to connect. And I'm just giving the Rebbe, of course, as my example, but it applies to anybody that is on that caliber. Any other great Torah scholar, giant, they live in that area. The Torah takes this in it, and we'll go back to show you a few other practical laws that it shows you over there in the Sefer HaChinuch, what this means. It says what it means. Okay. It says, the Torah scholar, this is learned that anyone who marries the daughter of a Torah scholar, So you marry the daughter of a Torah scholar, or marries his daughter to a Torah scholar, who gives benefit from his property to a Torah, is as if he clings to the divine presence. So you had people that were very, very simple, but they may have had money. So what would they do? They would they would go and they would take their money and they would say, I can't afford to study, but they would take his son-in-law and they would say, I want you to be a Torah scholar, and therefore I'll have the divine presence in my life. Because when Torah is being studied, God is present in your life. So you want to connect to God. God is within his teachings. When you have somebody that lives with those teachings, that's connecting to God. That's what it means to cling to him. Study the words of Agadah, which is the homiletical teachings, as through this you will recognize the one who spoke and the world came into being. So it's teaching us about all these. So he says, what's the whole purpose? What's the root? The root of the commandment is revealed, so that we learn to know the ways of God may be blessed. Okay, so this is telling us that if you want to know the way of God, connect to the tzaddikim. So those are the practical things. Live near good people. Make sure you connect to those Torah scholars. It's like saying that you want to be closer to the source of where the power is. If you want to actually have a connection, a real solid connection to God, you would connect to those people that have the connection. It's like they say, if you want to be successful in your business, find the people that are the best in your particular field, connect to them, and you'll be successful. If you want to have a connection to God, find the people that are most connected to God and connect to them, and you will become your own Talmid Chacham. You will build then your own connection with God. But the way you do that is by first connecting to the Talmid Chacham. Now, I want to just take us to a little bit of a different area. That it says in the Tanya, I didn't put this on the screen because I don't want to go into the details. In the second chapter of Tanya, it talks about the Jewish people being like one body. And we discussed this a little bit last week as well when we spoke about the concept of loving your fellow. So over there we discussed that we're all like one body. If you hurt another Jew, it's like you cutting your own finger, right? But the truth is that it's not just that we're all like one body, but we're actually all like different body parts, different parts of the body. And we're told that why is it most important to cleave, to connect with the Torah scholars or to the actual giants? Because it says they are called Rosh B'nai Yisrael, the head of the Jewish people. Like we said, Rebbe, the person who wrote down the Mishnah, or the general title of a Rebbe stands for Rosh B'nai Yisrael. What does it mean? The Jewish people are a body. And the head, the brain, is those righteous people. By connecting to those righteous tzaddikim, you're connecting to the brain. Do you want to be connected to your own brain? I certainly hope so. So by connecting, in other words, if you don't have a connection to the tzaddik, you're disconnected from your very self. The way that you find yourself, the way that you connect to your own essence is by being connected to the tzaddik. So I can't explain in words of any law that would be more important than this one, in truth. If you've done this, you can do all the rest. I should have found this video. It's somewhere on Chabad.org, I believe. It's definitely on YouTube. Of this man, he was one of these famous comedian Hasidim of the Rebbe. And he comes past the Rebbe and he said, I believe in the Rebbe, so to speak. I think he wanted to, I've got to find the video and I'll send it to any of you asks. But he was a charity collector. He collected for people that needed help with the cost of food for Shabbos and Yom Tov. He was a serious character, and he once passed the Rebbe and he said, I want to thank the Rebbe for the blessing. The Rebbe gave a blessing for something and it was fulfilled. So the Rebbe said, the blessing doesn't come from me, it comes from God. He says, well, listen, I don't know God, I know you. It's actually very funny because he's actually saying this directly to the Rebbe. He says, I know you. I don't know God. So he says, I'm thanking you because I know you. Which is, by the way, the Rebbe smiles and kind of thinks it's cute. But there's a lot of truth to it. The truth is that as people, we do struggle to connect to God. But if you connect to those that do have their solid belief, you are actually connecting to yourself, to your very essence of God. They will help you reveal within your own self your connection to God. So this is why we keep on doing the annoying thing that some people find annoying. And particularly Hasidim do this probably more than others. And that's we like to relate stories. And not just any stories. Our favorite stories that we like to do are stories of righteous people. The Rebbe and all the other Rebbes over the history. I once was reading a criticism of Chabad rabbis by a non-Chabad rabbi. And he had a whole like a shopping list of criticisms of Chabad rabbis. But the one that stuck out to me the most was that Chabad rabbis always, they cover over all intellect and academic and stories. And they kind of downplay to their crowd. And instead of teaching their crowd deep ideal ideas, they wash it down and dilute it with stories. So it's a criticism of Chabad rabbis. I don't think only Chabad rabbis, by the way, are guilty of this. I think any good rabbi that knows how to make their talks interesting, and I wish I was able to incorporate even more stories into my discussions and make it come alive. But that's exactly the point. The reason why we say stories is because we're trying to make it come alive. But there's another point. A story, there's a concept in Jewish law which tells us Ma'aser Rav. Ma'aser Rav is a very interesting halacha. There's a concept of some, as I mentioned before, the way Torah works is that you have interpretations to the Torah, and you have something which is a direct what's the word? Interpretation or direct description given by God himself to Moses, which has been given over generations. Now, sometimes we're not sure. You have different interpretations. What's the correct interpretation? And the rabbis would debate it. Now, there's two ways that you can end it. You could either say halacha. Halacha means that it's a tradition, Kabbalah. Sorry, not halacha. It's Kabbalah. Kabbalah means it's a tradition back to Moses. That means it's not up for interpretation. It's a direct interpretation that was given by Moses. That's one way of how you end the argument, and you cannot argue on that. The other way you answer is you talk it's Ma'aser Rav. Ma'aser Rav means that one of the great scholars of the previous generations acted in this particular way. So we argue what's the right way to do. Hey, we got a story from another righteous, the tzaddikim of the previous generation. And that will tell us, okay, if you have a Ma'aser Rav, that will tell us, okay, that's the law when there's a doubt in the case. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, and there's lots more details to this particular law, but I'm just telling you the prominence of the actions of the righteous have. There's so many laws in the Torah that the Talmud laws, when there's a doubt, that they just go, look, oh, King David acted in this way, and that's how we know the law. So now, my reply back to that rabbi that was criticizing us Chabad rabbis for giving too many stories, first of all, it makes it interesting. So that's just the very basic reason to. But number two is it makes it alive. Making it alive means that it makes it meaningful. It's your way of fulfilling this mitzvah. Voisid bakun. That's the way you cleave to God. In other words, by us listening to those stories, we're actually fulfilling this mitzvah. This mitzvah is to cleave to God. The meaning of cleaving to God means to cleave to the righteous ones. What does it mean? And we said not just to their teachings, but to their actions, to their stories. And that's why telling stories of the righteous becomes so important. As a matter of fact, we've dedicated a whole night in the Jewish calendar to storytelling, the Seder night. Not just storytelling of what happened by God through Moses, but it's a night of stories. And stories becomes the ultimate way of teaching and transferring the information of how to literally act as a Jew from one person to the other. And this teaches us that whenever we are listening to these stories, they're not just stories of what somebody did or something that happened. They're actually a direct command, or so to speak, of a direction of how to behave and how to live our lives. I'll tell you a quick last story, which is an interesting one. We know that there's thousands of stories about people that didn't know what to do, but they listened to the tzaddik, and the tzaddik was able to advise them. So there's one interesting story where the Ruzhiner, who also lived about 150 years, known as the Ruzhiner Rebbe, and he was a very, very holy and pious man, and many people went to visit him. Once there was two women that went to visit him, and they presented him some rabbis over the generations. Not all rabbis would accept women individually. The Rebbe was one of those unique people, and there's of course halachic issues with how you do it. Anyway, so my understanding of the story is that they gave in their letters to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe wrote the replies on a separate piece of paper, the Ruzhiner Rebbe. And somehow these two ladies confused each other's answers. The shamash, or the helper, gave the wrong answer to each lady. What was the case? The one lady came because her husband was really unwell. And she wanted advice for what to do with her husband being unwell. The other lady came because their family was in tremendous debt. And they couldn't afford to pay the bill, and the landlord was about to kick them out of their house. So that was the two stories. And the advice that the reply that was given to the lady whose husband was unwell was, put leeks and bloodletting or whatever it is on your husband's back, whatever, some type of medication that he advised. I can't remember what the advice was for the other lady. Anyway, the other lady saw the letter, said, "This is a bunch of nonsense. It didn't have anything to do with livelihood. Didn't do what the letter said," and rightfully so to a certain degree, because it wasn't even her response. The other lady didn't question it. She saw the response. She doesn't know how putting leeks on her husband's back by making him bleed and bloodletting is going to help him solve his financial issue. But that's what he did. That's what you did. The Rebbe said that's what you do. So the story goes that lady, she took the note, she did what the Rebbe said, and the landlord, the wife of the landlord, saw the husband with the blood and the stains, and she said, "Oh," she went to her husband, she pleaded, "Please, please, he's got blood all over his back, he's suffering, he's unwell, please forego all that he owes us." And and they overcame all their things. To teach you that what? That we're supposed to listen to these people till we understand why or what or how. Sometimes it even could be unintentional, but when we listen and we abide, then only good things happen. All right, l'chaim, friends. Thanks for joining us, and have a great night. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to let us know. Thank you.
Good show. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hi,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Laila tov.
Laila tov.
Laila tov.
Are you trying to talk, Fritz? You're on silent if you're trying to talk.
Sorry, yes, I have one more